Welcome to The Final Curtain Never Closes, presented by the National Museum of Funeral History. I'm your host, Genevieve Vasquez, President and CEO of the museum. If you find value in these conversations, I invite you to support the show by sharing this episode, subscribing on Apple and YouTube. Now let us begin. Today I'm joined by a fascinating guest. She helps us remember times that have passed, perhaps memories that have been lost. I want to welcome Jenny Tran from the Pacific Atrocities Education Organization. Jenny, welcome. And I'm really excited to learn about what you do and the importance of your work and how you're preserving the history and the memories.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I started this organization like about 12 years ago now. I thought it was 10, but it's actually more like 12. But
amazing how time flies, right?
I know. It's just like, wow, I'm surprised myself. And what we do is that like 12 years ago, it was still kind of possible to reach out to survivors of World War II and ask them like what had happened during the war. And so I've been collecting like survivor testimonies, and as time goes, some of those survivors are like fading. And so I started collecting archive material from the National Archives. And I think I spent about it's even before COVID, so at least the last 8 years collecting archival material from the National Archives about World War II in Asia, especially because no one really talked about the war in Asia. The war actually in Asia killed about like 30 million people.
Wow.
And that's the lower end estimate. The higher end estimate is like 42 million. And what got me interested is that when I was growing up, my grandma was always talking about World War II, and like she would get upset if I put on like Japanese anime. And it wasn't until like she passed away that we find like a box of military yen, and I was like, oh, maybe my grandma was, and because at the time she was living in Hong Kong and during the war. And so that's when I was thinking like, wow, maybe what she was talking about was real, like, you know, what had happened to her. And so after she passed away and we found this military yen, I was thinking, wow, maybe that's why she was all upset when I was watching anime in front of her. And that's why she threw away like my whole box of manga. I saved so much. I had to save so much money as a kid to like buy manga little by little. And she just one day, she was just so angry that she tossed away my whole box of manga. And so I was thinking like, wow, maybe, you know, the anger came from somewhere. And so after she passed away, and after we found all of her stuff, I was thinking like, wow, that must have stemmed from somewhere. And so I started doing more research, and I had this really boring job. So after work, I had a lot of time to read. And I was reading like The Rape of Nanking and like The Rising Sun by John Toland, and also like The Death Factory. And I was very fascinated because I'm like, wow, I never learned about this part of history. And like the United States was actually quite involved. If you think about like the Pacific War, like I only remember watching Pearl Harbor, and I had never realized that the Pearl Harbor was the same war that my grandma suffered from in Hong Kong, because like within 8 hours, they went from Pearl Harbor to Hong Kong. And so I was just thinking like, wow, you know, if I didn't know, and, you know, I wasn't uneducated, a lot of people probably didn't know about this. And so I was thinking like, maybe I can find a job where I could like maybe as an analyst or maybe like a researcher to work in this field, because there are so many World War II like center about the European front.
Mm-hmm.
And upon Googling, then I couldn't find anything.
If I may, you know, when I hear World War II, of course, there's two things that has always come to my mind. Of course, you know, being in America myself also is, and education in school, right, was Pearl Harbor, and then they jumped to the European war and the Holocaust era, right? That came out of that. And so it's kind of like, excuse me, those are my two memories of World War II. And so I find it very fascinating that you're bringing this other element. And I went to the World War II Museum in Louisiana. And that is when it really did a fascinating job of telling the story and finally shed light on, like you said, after Pearl Harbor, they went to Hong Kong. I didn't even know that.
Yeah.
I did not know that until I had gone to that museum and realized that there was this whole other area, this whole Asian area that was affected way before we even got into the European region. And I was like, why is that story not being told?
Yeah. And so I was thinking, wow, maybe I can get a job. And I really hated my job then. And so I was naive enough to like quit my job and try to start an organization. And
very brave of you, I would say, not naive. I would say brave.
and 12 years later, here I am. And I spent the last like 8 years looking through like a lot of the art, declassified material that I think are in really rough shape, but they're all like, because during World War II, they were using compounded paper. And so it's very fragile. And even Civil War paper, it's more like made out of cotton, and they're more durable than the World War II paper from like 80 years ago.
Wow.
And so that's what I thought was like, okay, I need to do it now. If not, I think the paper is just going to fade away. And also on top of that, like no one is going to remember what had happened, or no one's even going to know. Like you said.
Where were these papers? These papers that you found, where were they?
College Park, Maryland, in Archive 2, the National Archive number 2. Because when Japan surrendered, the U.S. had occupied it 2 weeks after its surrender. And so a lot of this paper that I found were, I mean, they survive by just accident, or, you know, they weren't destroyed as evidence. And so it's very interesting. You get like testimonies to like interrogation records, and also to like affidavits for from people who survived the war, from people who went through like POW camps. And I didn't realize like the terrible conditions of the POW camps. Like people were more likely to survive like a POW camp in Nazi Germany than in wartime Japan, which I mean, I didn't know about that.
I didn't either.
Yeah. And these are like Americans who suffered. And so it just led to like this really great question of like, why did we leave that part of history out? And I remember reading The Flags of Our Fathers, James Bradley, but then I had no idea that like James Bradley's book was describing, you know, also the same war that my grandma was suffering in. And until like recently we started doing podcasting, or actually I realized I made that connection like 12 years ago.
Wow.
And it's just an interesting like way to tie all the world events together, because then I no longer saw it as incidents, but actually saw it as like all of this like things are all linked together, and one thing led to another. And and so now James Bradley and I are doing twice a month we do a podcast called Pacific Front Untold, which talks about World War II history in Asia. And also in like on Iwo Jima and like whatnot. So he just did an episode about explaining his father did actually the first flag and not the second flag that is on the Rosenberg photo. So yeah.
We are back to the conversation in just a moment. First, I invite you to support the show by sharing this episode, subscribing on Apple and YouTube, and by visiting or donating to the National Museum of Funeral History at nmfh.org. Your support keeps these conversations going and helps us remind one another that any day above ground is a good one. So we're talking about the Not only like, I kind of want to say the death of a war, right? The death of a war that was never told, that actually happened, right? It's like kind of like living, somebody lives their life, and if you never tell their story or never tell it that they actually existed, it's like you were saying in your, we talked about that second death, right? There's nobody there to talk about it. There's nobody there to remember it. And you have found this profound niche of trying to keep those stories alive and keep the legacy of the war and the people who lost their lives during that war, keep that alive and in the profound educational forum of our future.
Yeah.
Which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, because these people, a lot of these people like who fought on either side or who are like survived the war. So, for example, Dr. Jinbi Chan, has been a really good supporter of ours, and she told me that she survived World War II in China, and she lost her brother because of it, and for like at least 30-40 years she never talked about it, because she was then getting on with her life, and she later became like a math professor at Sonoma State University. She got a PhD in math. She was fascinated. I mean, she's great. She's a really great person. And she told me that, like, when her late husband brought her to see a World War II movie, she started crying, because of like the impact she had the impact it had on her, and she was crying so hard that she couldn't even like go from the theater to the car. Her late husband had to like had to carry her to the car, and
Wow.
yeah, and she never really talked about what had happened to her during the war until like I think maybe 12 years ago, 15 years ago, I started bringing her to do workshops with students, and she was sharing about how she had lost her brother during the war from starvation, and also from like just working in. I mean, she was she was so young, and she had always thought that she should have replaced her brother in dying and whatnot, and it's just so sad. It's such a crazy and sad story that the first time she said it at a workshop, she actually started crying so hard that I was like, oh my gosh, what do I do? But like last year we had a conference in September, and she actually just dropped a tear, and she told me that like by telling her story she's healing in a way, and it's it's kind of, I wouldn't say like good, but like it's kind of satisfying for me to watch like survivors of these stories kind of healing in their own way. And we were able to also do some oral history research with these women in the Central Coast about and they're all Filipina, and we were able to interview them for how they survived World War II in the Philippines, and it's really fascinating because I never really think about women as like fighters, right? You think more about them as like victim in terms of like, or like growing some food or like working in manufacturing. But like after MacArthur was saying that like I shall return, then like the Philippines fought the Japanese with almost no resources for like 2 or 3 years, and what was interesting is that like it's at first they were thinking that like, okay, the Japanese are coming to like liberate us from our US like occupiers, and then as soon as they saw how brutal the Japanese were, they were like, oh, never mind, let's fight with the Americans. And it's such like, it gives them like, I think it gives perspectives too.
Let's talk about the doctor when she You said that, there was so much time that passed before she actually started to talk about it. Do you feel that that was kind of like across the culture of the people living in Asia, that they just didn't talk about it? Or was it just that one individual that didn't talk about it?
That's a great question, and I asked her why didn't she talk about it for like decades, and she told me that she was really focused on her life and doing better and getting out of like that mentality. And she also told me that like in Asian culture, you don't really talk about your suffering. You want to focus on like the positive in life. And so, and people are also ashamed and embarrassed to talk about that, and for a while, because after the war, in her case, she was, her parents kept trying to have a son and they couldn't have a son. And then she ended up with like many girl siblings. And so in a way, the family members don't want to talk about it. And yeah, so I think that's what happened. And I also interview like these Chinese comfort women who were like sex slaves in China during World War II. And what's fascinating is that they also didn't want to talk about it because it's shameful. It's shameful to talk about like being captured into a comfort station where they were basically brutalized and like raped by the Japanese military for like 2-3 years. I mean, some of them even became pregnant. One of the story that really stuck with me is that one woman was pregnant, and when she was like and after the war, her mom told her to not tell anyone that she was pregnant. And then she kind of kept it a secret. And then and then her mom and her like buried the baby at some rural area and just called it, and then just kind of hid it as a secret and never talked about it again. So I think the war creates so much suffering that no one really wanted to talk about it. And it really brought shame to them that, their government wasn't there to protect them. They were such like helpless, they were in such helpless situation. And yeah, and they were just trying to move on, I think.
Wow. What an oxymoron. A comfort station where you're raped. Why do they call it a comfort station?
Yeah, it's actually a crazy story because during like the Japanese invasion of China, so many people were raped and then they got like STDs, and then they were like, okay, let's just not do that, because when you start raping like a big population, it's like an uncontrolled environment. So we don't know who has STDs and whatnot. So then they wanted to have a controlled environment, a comfort station where there were like physicians to check if there's STDs and there's like a condom like that is being dispensed and whatnot. So then it's more of a controlled environment.
So basically it was organized rape. Basically, yes. Right?
Systematically.
Wow.
Yeah. And then they call it comfort station because it provides the Japanese soldiers comfort. But
definitely no comfort to the women, unfortunately, right? No comfort for the women.
It was very sickening, I mean, from what I understood. And that's just like, yeah, and it's like a taboo topic in Asian culture. I think even some of the European women who were captured in like the Dutch Indies, they didn't talk about it until like in the 1990s. And I think a lot of people like don't talk about these things until they're like about to die, or like they're really old and they want to talk about it, and they just then that's a lot of confessions happen that way. For example, this guy who's like in his 90s, he worked at like this biological warfare camp Unit 731 as a teenager, because a lot of the men were fighting at the war, and so then they didn't have anyone else to work at this camp, Unit 731, which was doing biological research, and he was like harvesting organs to like test out how organs would react to like certain things. And he didn't want to talk about it until he was like in his late 80s, and he's been on newspapers, and his daughter and his wife told him to stop talking because that's going to embarrass the whole family. So on both sides, there are people who talk like when they're super old, but then it's like, okay, why didn't you talk about that earlier? Because like they were trying to live their lives and also just move on from the war in a sense.
And maybe they didn't want the repercussion of their stories to be told to taint the future, their future, or the life that they were trying to build. So it makes great sense. And I think that kind of leads to why we have so many, deathbed confessions, right? People really want to talk about the atrocities within their life and know now that it doesn't have a profound effect on their future. However, it's a record they want to have in history. And I think sometimes when someone has a deathbed confession like that and they talk about it, it leads those who are left behind now I want to say maybe the curiosity or perhaps the want to validate the story. And then we start doing all the research, right? So it sounds like kind of what you did. You had your grandma who was affected by, you were innocently watching anime. You were innocently saving up for, was it manga?
Manga, yeah.
Did I say it correct?
Buying manga.
Yeah. And so for you, this is so innocent for you, not realizing it had a profound effect. And I'm really curious as to why anime and manga. Why did you ever find out why they had such a profound effect on your grandmother?
Yeah, because they're made in Japan. And for her, in her mind, the Japanese are these people who basically tortured the place that she lived in when she was younger. So that she'll call them like turnip heads and whatnot. And she would not be upset if I was watching Winnie the Pooh, for example. But
of course, because that's really like Americanized.
Yeah, but when it came to Japanese anime, she was all out. It was, and so as I research more about like the Hong Kong occupation and also like the Japanese atrocities on China and on Asia, I understood a lot more.
Were you ever able to help your grandmother come to a better attitude towards the Japanese, or was the atrocities that she suffered so grand that they basically kept her hating the Japanese her entire life? Did she ever in her life learn to say, okay, that was history. Japan is transforming, changing. Let me be able to sit with my grandmother and our granddaughter and watch an anime. Did she ever come to that?
No. and I think it's partially because I didn't understand where she was coming from. And I didn't understand it until she passed away. And in a way, I kind of regret that, right? Like there's a sense of regret that I didn't understand what she was talking about. I thought she was maybe demented. And so that's, partially on me.
I think that actually by you being enlightened by that, I think that some of our listeners might also have this keen awareness that you just created for them, is that instead of because like you said, our older generation, they went through a life of not really talking about things. And because they don't talk about it, when they finally do in their older age, like we, explained earlier, that we may come off thinking that they're in a demented mind because the things they're talking about are just so foreign or so profound or so grotesque that we're like, that didn't happen. Because again, we didn't talk about it. So there's nothing really written in history for us to say, oh, okay, like if your grandparent was perhaps a victim of a concentration camp, there's so much of that being taught in to the younger generations that if your grandparent were to start talking about it, it wouldn't be chalked up as being delusional or demented. Whereas, like you said, with your grandmother and her outbursts of behavior that didn't align with her normal behavior, I think that there's something to be said to that perhaps we need to stop and pause.
Yes.
And try and understand what they were going through or what they went through.
That's actually really good insight, because I think what was going on with her just didn't fit my narrative, right? And also didn't fit, like, what I was learning in school. And like, so then there was this really disconnect between her and the life I was living. And so then it made me think that she was demented.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that you're actually onto something and really helping open up the whole profound effect of the war on Asia. And it was a short war, right? It was relatively short in the span of what we consider the war to be.
So I don't think it was that short, to be honest, because Japan had occupied Manchuria in 1931. Okay. And a lot of people think that like World War II started in like 1939, but in reality, it started out in like 1931 when Japan had already occupied Manchuria. And what's interesting is that like we don't really talk about that. We think about World War II as 1939, but in 1931, they were already doing that. And then by 1933, when the League of Nations asked them to to not do that, and they don't recognize this like occupied region, Manchukuo, Japan just simply walked out of the League of Nations. And in a way, like then Mussolini and Hitler saw that and was like, oh, international laws are kind of a joke. And like in 1937, they started the Marco Polo Bridge, which is and then it goes on. But so I think the Japanese invasion of China happened in like 1931, which is 10 years before Pearl Harbor.
So see, now you just educated me on information I wasn't even aware of, because again, it was not talked about. We think World War II started with Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
When in fact there was so much more of a war going on behind, I want to call it behind the scenes. I know it's just, it was in another country. So again, it's not being taught like it should. The facts of it, right? It's just being highlighted, right? The elements of World War II is being highlighted, and it's not really being expanded upon to get the full picture. Because I know when I visited the World War II Museum, I went in just thinking of Pearl Harbor and the European conflict, basically the Holocaust era and Hitler's invasion and his profound effect on the concentration camps, right? That was my educational background from my younger years. That's what I went into that museum with, and that's all I knew. I got in there and I realized, I was like, wow, okay. So the reason why I said short, because what I learned at the museum was, oh, there was this whole invasion by Japan, but to me it was a short snippet of World War II, and now you've just come and enlightened me that wait, no. It actually started 10 years before, but again, nobody talks about it, nobody highlights it. So it's almost like the forgotten war, right? Like isn't it the Korean War is the forgotten war, I believe, in history?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, the Korean War and I feel like the Vietnam War were an extension of World War II. And it's very sad,
And there's so many different conflicts, right, that have happened either before or after a major world war that I think, I want to like to say that most everybody understands the Vietnam War, right? So it's Vietnam, it's World War II. World War I is, really, really back there. So there's maybe not as much talk about it. But to me, in my generation, it was the Vietnam War, World War II, and then, all of our current day conflicts. But yeah, there's so many wars that people don't realize that are out there that aren't talked about.
It's very sad, if you think about human history of all these conflicts, and especially like World War II in Europe and whatnot. Like, if you see these guys fighting, I feel like I saw this one picture of like the French fighting the Germans, and I almost felt like, wow, if they met each other at like a summer camp, they could have been friends. I see almost no difference.
Yeah,
in these,
exactly.
like, young people.
Yeah. They. I went to a play or an opera just recently called The Silent Night, right? And The Silent Night was talking about when they were in conflict, and on Christmas Eve, the war stopped, and they all, basically drank and had conversation with each other, just like you said. They probably could have just played ball together and not even realized it, right? They did. In that one night, they all mingled together. It was the Scottish, it was the French, and it was the Germans, and they were all together for that one night. And then they went back to fighting again the next day. It was. I really try to understand I want to say the whole mindset of war, and I still cannot grasp it.
I think it's because of the government who's, trying to have this and have that. And then, like, I think war is just an extension of, diplomacy gone wrong. They could have chatted it out. They could have talked it out. But
I think if there was I think us women would have got together and had coffee and talked it out, right? We're less on conflict and more on peace and nurturing and trying to find a better way to handle things. But that's just my perspective. But yeah, it's and I think one of the things that we tend to really overlook in any war and in any conflict, at the beginning of our conversation, you talked about the millions and millions of lives lost. And, we're not just talking about service people who have been drafted into the war or who raised their right hand to go and serve the country. We're also talking about the people who are just innocent bystanders, right? Who are, perhaps sitting in their living room and enjoying the evening with their family. And then, war happens in their living room, right? In their home. And it just happens all the time, every day. And so I think that's one of the things that we forget is not only the profound effect of those who are still alive, but the amount of loss of life during these wars. Yeah. It's such a huge amount, and we never give credit to. We give credit to those who lose their life in service, but I don't think we give enough credit also to those who lose their life just living life, and then war happens, right?
Yeah, I think so. And even like recently, I did an article on our blog about these people who were captured, and then they were human experimented on, and then a grandnephew of that person reached out to me and was like, yeah, my grandpa had that was then missing his sibling for like his whole life. There were only 3 of them, and that's like 1/3 of the family missing. And just imagine, right? Like that 1/3 of the family missing could have been another 9 cousins for him or something like that. And it's just, and it's like the whole side of that family missing, and it's quite unfortunate, and it's really depressing to think about.
Yeah. I mean, can you imagine what a family tree would look like if we didn't have war? I mean, the amount of
oh my gosh,
the root structure and the branches would just be humongous, and perhaps there would be greater family ties than we ever would have expected because of that.
We'll be a lot more productive. I think we might be a little bit more productive because of the amount of people.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and I always think that I this is my mindset. I'm like, okay, it took like right now watching, I did a lot of watching the unfortunate attack on Gaza and trying to understand the war and the loss and just kind of wrap my head around it as a person of empathy and being empathetic towards the people that are in Gaza. And then, even right now with our current day war that's going on in Iran and stuff. And I started thinking, I was like, you're talking about we'd be so much further along. So I sit there and I watch how it might take I'm going to just guess, like 3 months to build an apartment building to house 100 families. Okay. Maybe longer, maybe 6 months. And now all these families have come in and they're settled and they're going about their daily life. And now they're feeling confident in being able to flourish and to build and expand. And then in seconds, what took months to build is all gone. And then you have to start all over again. And it's like you're taking like 5 steps forward and 20 steps backwards. Right. And I'm like, yeah, I can't wrap my head around it. I can't wrap my head around the motivation behind destruction. It doesn't.
Well, currently is a holy war. And honestly, when I read about this like holy war situation, I don't understand.
Yeah, I don't understand that either.
Yeah, I mean, I go to church, but like I am not that religious, to be honest with you. And so like when it's being pitched as this holy war, and then there's like a religious like purpose behind it, just like when they were pitching that, when the Japanese were pitching that they're better than every other Asian, and then like they need to create this greater Asian coast prosperity sphere. I don't understand. And that can't wrap my head around this.
And that was Hitler too, right? Yeah. Hitler was trying to create this supreme, existence of the German bloodline and culture, right? It's one man's thinking that they're better than the other, and then they put religion behind it, and that becomes their motivation, I reckon. But then again, you kind of, I'm like you. I'm a Christian. I'm a believer. I just don't dive deep into religion, any one religion. But I have a little bit of, understanding of several different religions just because of my educational background. And being a funeral director also, you kind of have to understand, have an understanding of all the different religions and how they are rendered and respected for the dead. Right. And I sit there and I think, God, what an oxymoron, because religion is supposed to be teaching acceptance and love and being neighborly and friendly. And it's like, where does war come in all of this, right? It's like two extreme opposites, but yet they still put it under the umbrella of religion. And again, I think that's just as incomprehensible as the motivation to destroy for me.
And like you said, and as a funeral director, that like, how heartbreaking it is for people to miss like a whole part of their family trip.
Mm-hmm.
Just so that like, yeah, it's insane. And for me, like, writing something about 80 years ago and people are still reaching out like, oh yeah, and then this part of my family went missing, and because of that, and then like we still, my grandpa missed him like every single day. I'm like, wow, this is, in a way, this is really like, is really sad.
Yeah. And sometimes with war, they never get their loved ones back. They never get that family member back. They never get them the opportunity to
or they never even know what had happened until 80 years later, because it was classified. It was so horrific that it was classified. Like, for example, the Flyboys that James Bradley wrote, that was like his second book. It's about the Tsukishima incident where the members of the military were actually eaten on Tsukishima. And yeah, they were cannibalized because they believe that the Japanese had this belief that they needed to kill their enemy and then eat their liver to get their chemo. And then James Bradley wrote it in such a way that like you understand these people's like background, and then you just feel really sad. And then like George Bush, like who actually survived to Tsukishima, a submarine rescued him, right, and got him out of the situation. But then George Bush ended up being like the older Bush, and he is like a great businessman. He became vice president. He was head of CIA, and then he was president. And so you just wonder, like, okay, so if those 8 other airmen didn't die like that on Tsukishima, weren't eaten, weren't cannibalized, what would have happened to them? Right? Maybe they could have become very successful businessmen. Maybe they could have become president. Like, it's just when I was reading that book, I was like, wow, world history could have been changed had Bush been like, cannibalized too on this island. It's insane. And like what you were saying about family trees, like how many more people could we have had these tragedies not happen like that?
Yeah. I mean, when you start thinking about it, it really can become overwhelming. But I think it's very important for us moving forward in a future to understand the profound effect that we're having when we're doing these type of acts, right? And the ripple effect that it'll have for generations to come, truly. It's profound. Yeah. It's almost mind-boggling. It's hard to wrap for me, hard to wrap my head around some of these concepts. And I think we only touched on maybe like 4 or 5 concepts that have such great depth to them, right? And profound effect at the same time, So with your work at the Pacific Atrocities Education, is this, your work with it, the title is Pacific Atrocities of Education, correct? Or is this an actual organization?
Yes, it's actually a 501c3 organization. So, if your listeners can feel free to support our work.
Yeah, tell us more about how we can support your work. Are you a brick and mortar, or are you an online existence? Tell us a little bit more about your organization.
Yeah, we're more of an online assistance right now. Just brick and mortar is very hard because we, believe it or not, even though that the war happened 80 years ago, there's still a lot of denialists. Like we were doing some events and then we got protested.
Oh no.
People deny that it happened, even though it happened 80 years ago.
Wow.
And it's crazy. So anyway, we're more online, and we have YouTube and podcast called Pacific Front Untold. And we are also on our website, pacificatrocities.org. People can feel free to subscribe to our YouTube. We also have some publications related to like things that we have discovered throughout the years. For example, like the Panay guerrillas fighters I was talking about earlier, that I was touching on, how they fought the Japanese when they had no resources in the Philippines. And also people can feel free to donate so we can keep, digitizing and also keeping these memories alive.
So is this? I'm looking at this as a wealth of resource for not only our future generations, but people who want to learn more about our past. And then if there are still any survivors of World War II, or maybe family members that heard stories of their loved ones who fought in World War II or had some profound effect because of the war, is there an opportunity or a platform for them to come and tell their stories or get in touch with you to talk about it, or provide more validation to the work that you're doing?
Yes, feel free to drop your contact on the contact form. We'll definitely get back to you if we want to collaborate.
Yeah, that's great. So can you tell me your website again?
Pacificatrocities.org.
Pacificatrocities.org. Okay, great. And I guess there's a contact section on there that if somebody wants to reach out to you, they can. Also encourage people, if they are having difficulties or don't really remember, they can also come to contact@nmfh.org, and I will also link you up with Jenny to help you continue to tell your story or learn more about the Pacific Atrocities and the effect that the whole Asian conflict had during World War II. And also, if you just want to learn more or contribute, definitely, reach out to her, reach out to us if you can't get a hold of her, and we'll get you in touch with Jenny. And it's a wonderful collaboration. And Jenny is. In the future, I'm working on, we have a veterans exhibit at the National Museum of Funeral History. And one of my goals is to enhance that exhibit. And in that design concept, I have where I actually want to highlight each war and conflict that we've had over the years. And my goal is to really highlight the cost of that war. And when I say the cost, I'm not talking about the monetary cost. I'm talking about the cost of lives that were lost. And so I'm hoping that perhaps we can work together on creating and gathering facts around the wars that you have working knowledge on, so that I can bring that to light in my works with the future veterans exhibit. Would you be willing to do that with me?
Of course. I'll be more than happy to do that with you. I'll be honored.
Oh, thank you. That would be great. Because like I said, it's worth that we put this in writing, and that we make it a known fact in history that this did happen and people were affected. So I really look forward to working with you on that. I'm excited for that.
Thank you so much. And I think that would be also, in a way, create a gap of information, create this bridge of the gap on this information, so that people can understand their elder generation a lot more.
Very true. Very true. I couldn't have said it any better. So, well, Jenny, thank you so much for your time. And I'm really excited to help share the knowledge of the effects of World War II on the Asian theater, and I hope to bring more awareness and educational insights on this for you.
Thank you for having me today.
Thank you for joining this episode of The Final Curtain Never Closes. If you enjoyed this conversation, please spread the word by sharing it from your favorite podcast app. And be sure to plan your visit, or you can plan a virtual tour at nmfh.org. We have 2 different levels for the virtual tour. We have an individual one for a 48-hour time span in which you can peruse the museum, or you can take the annual membership, which will allow you a 365-day tour of the museum at your leisure. And remember, any day above ground is a good one.